It's funny, I'm listening to Practicing the Power of Now audio, and Eckhart Tolle's talking about being, and I'm in a park, and not many people have walked by, but somebody walks by with a shirt that says being on it, and the number 7. I don't know if that's a brand, kind of like you'll see different brands with their number, but his shirt said being. It's funny. And I had that event this morning that I took extra calming, tranquilizing supplements for. I took a zinc. I usually take 3 zinc a day, 2 when I go to bed and 1 in the evening, but I took 1 in the morning, so I'll skip the evening one and take 2 at bedtime. And I took an extra tryptophan, which usually I only take at night. And I took 2 extra taurine with lithium, and I've been doing 1 lithium in the morning and 4 at night to help me sleep. But I did 3 lithium in the morning, so I'll take probably 3, so that's a total of 6 instead of 5 today. I'll take 3 at night tonight. And I took extra glycine powder, and it helped. I felt completely calm, so that's good. And I did have some tension, 22 minutes of tense breathing in like 3.5 hours, which isn't too bad. I did the percentage, it's like 10%. Whereas yesterday when I was at that Emerging Proud event, it was 22% tense breathing in terms of percentage. And when I hung out with that lady for over 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours, it was like 4% tense breathing. But it could have also been because I was probably active breathing for part of it because we were walking around, but we did stand and talk for like an hour. So that was an opportunity for all the tense breathing to show up if that's what was going to happen, and it didn't really. So that was cool, and it was kind of a cool experience to just be wandering and then walk around with somebody for an hour and kind of make a new friend, even though they live kind of far because I was in town. And also I'm probably going to the island in 2 weeks. Well, I'm planning to. So yeah, it was just kind of cool to meet someone that I resonate with quite a bit. And she was saying intuitive things like, you seem like you have calm energy and stuff like that. I can't really remember that much of the conversation, but she did say, get out of here. And you know, it's no one's fault that I feel the need to go somewhere else. I think there's no personal selves that are causing trouble. To me, it is the conditioning in general. It's conditioning. There's this world of conditioning, which is most of the world, and there's an unconditioned world where one has access to immeasurable beauty and infinite perceptions. One can be delighted by the light on leaves for an hour, and one is really with that. And in that hour, it's changing the brain to be more perceptive to that beauty, and the brain is itself becoming that beauty itself, as opposed to this fully conditioned brain operating in a field of limited human constructs. So I think I've had a little bit of I'm not sure, I feel like I've seen that by interacting with the conditioning, it reconditions my experience to experience myself as a conditioned being. And I don't know if removing oneself from that helps to allow the brain to stabilize in the unconditioned, and then one can go back into the conditioned and not be reconditioned by it, or I don't know how it works, or if one has to stay away from that completely. That is yet to be seen. I really don't know. But I feel like I've realized that I can't help but be reconditioned. And I've talked about many of the possible mechanisms of that in terms of the light coming out of another's eyes and being warped by the way one is seen by others. And even that isn't quite right. I don't exist as a separate me. There is no separate, consistent me. How I manifest in my subjective experience and another subjective experience is the sum total of our energies together. And that will create how I feel it is happening in my subjective experience and in theirs. And it's not congruent, and we're both trying to have some kind of continuity going. So like, if I meet somebody one time and then I meet them again, I'm going to want to have whatever I saw of them the first time, I'm going to want to like add to that continuously. Like, now I know this, and now I know this, and now I know this. I don't want to start again afresh and think like, I know nothing about this person. Let's see what happens when I have nothing in my mind about how they are. And how they are does depend partially on our approach to that person. So the way I'm approached by people who know me is going to partly create what manifests. And I could say, well, I can change that. And I can partly. The trouble is, though, is changing too much, in the past at least, has manifested as, oh, well, this must mean this person is mentally ill because they've changed so much from what we know of them as themselves. So when a person changes to the point of sort of being out of the conditioning in that the person no longer manifests as what's expected from the others looking at that person, and they supposedly think they know that person, and when that person is outside the conditioning, so the conditioning doesn't affect them, and they're able to manifest as a free expression of themselves, that's really confusing to other people, because it's like totally cognitively dissonant, and people don't like that. Because if one is all of a sudden acting super free, and the other's like, I know this person, they're not usually this way, then they have to change too. They have to change their interaction with this being. And other people don't like interacting with free human beings because they're so fluid and changeable and inconsistent that it's uncomfortable. And that energy makes the others inconsistent. So they, at some point, they revert to a consistency of being fearful, and then projecting that fear onto the other, like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with this person? I'm so scared. They're not themselves. And then that fear affects the other. If the perspective was, oh wow, they're so different, this is so great, let's play around with this, let's see where this goes, let's have fun, I want to change too, I want to be so different. But people don't want to change, so then they'd rather change that free human being back into some semblance of what they know of them. And it's so complex, it's not just that, but it's partly that. And my brain has been working a lot of things out in the background, but nothing that it's seen this time around of working things out has brought the brain cells fear. I feel like the brain cells are seeing and understanding things, and it's hard to explain. It's almost like they're able to keep up with what is being processed and not be afraid. Because sometimes what can happen is if the brain starts going through this process of trying to understand, it can see something that is just too much, and then that too muchness creates fear, like, oh my God. Or it also creates, it sees one thing and then it tries to apply that to so many other things, past, present, possible futures. You know, maybe in terms of wanting to predict and control, which is an ego function. But I think that's part of what has shifted, is that the brain cells are more fascinated and curious than wanting to use whatever is understood to predict or control the future, or I don't know. And the whole thing of the way the brain is conditioned to process things egoically and separatively, along with how it's attempting to mutate into processing things, those things being mixed together, that's what causes so much of the chaos. So it's a real challenge to completely negate those other things. Like, for example, when one is going into higher states of energy and gets to a point where one sees sort of the fallacy of the way the brain was operating and the way society operates, when it sees that fallacy, in a way it's free of it. But then as soon as it's free of it and it sees it as false, and then also sees that it's completely surrounded by the structures, the brain steps out of those structures of consciousness and sees all those structures of consciousness as false, not as what it has to be, but what is operating. And then as soon as one's outside of it, one realizes one's alone, one also realizes that one is surrounded, alone and surrounded by all those structures, and one is then terrified. And so when the brain cells are terrified, the body just runs in fear, and it's afraid of everything. And so, you know, you have these people running for their lives and then saying all these crazy things that they see, which could be from any time, past, present, possible, future. Because when the brain is outside of time, in terms of the continuity of conditioning, it also can access anything in this whole tiny, limited human construct from the beginning of how that operation, when it started. And then one's like running in fear, and then people are chasing after to try and recapture that consciousness into the continuity. And it's really complicated. So it's like the brain becomes free, but then the body realizes it's trapped, and then it's doing all these things that but then part of what the brain has seen recently is that one doesn't have to do anything. Because in previous experience, when the brain has stepped outside of time and then thought like, oh my gosh, I have to do something, I have to run, I have to get away. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do anything. So when the brain can get itself to a beautiful park where it can sit here and be in the felt realization that one doesn't have to do anything, one can look at the birds and listen to them and watch them eat and play and call to each other and be completely delighted with that. So one is then in an appropriate environment for the brain to feel safe in doing nothing. Because the other type is what the brain wants to run from. So You know, I have no idea, but I don't know. See, I have no idea about the whole, like, ideal environment thing versus can one be fine anywhere? I don't think so, because I think the initial, when the brain steps out of it and then starts running like crazy, and then gets captured by psychiatry and like drugged back into seeing things in a separate way, and then called non-functional because the brain still has this sense of there's nothing to do, and then that's interpreted as lack of motivation. And then when one's taking toxic medications, the brain isn't able to do the very powerful, passive, yet infinitely active process of doing nothing. The body does nothing. The brain does next to nothing because it's being poisoned. And then it gravitates towards more poisonous things like TV and all that. It's like trapping the brain in the resonance from that which it had a glimpse of freedom from. And so it'll never again be happy in those structures. And, you know, there's a whole mental health system for you. You know, if you put people who got out of those structures and into that freedom state, if they went into that and they're incredibly fearful, and you put them down in paradise, people would be quite content doing absolutely nothing. And if they're looking at paradise, the brain cells are absorbing the nutrition of paradise and nature and beauty and the earth, and how our brain was before we got so fascinated by all this machinating. Or machinating, I don't know how you say it. But we plot people in psych wards, and then they become that which they are bathed in, which is the structures of being mental patients. And then, I don't know, just assuming that the brain wants to operate the way that it is or was operating. The brain is bowing out, man. You see it in the little children coming up nowadays who don't want all this word abstracting about the world. And I printed out like 40 pages of notes of insights. I don't know if I want to talk about them or if they have any energy at all. I don't know if I'm meant to talk about those and be by myself, or go back into the conditioning and try to be okay. I don't know. Usually when I go away, my relationships here feel fine. They feel like, okay, well, I'm feeling fine now. Bye. Like, to see you later. Love you. But right now it feels like I gotta get the hell out of here. So it feels kind of like get me away from this conditioning, which is kind of how it feels sometimes when one goes from, say, kind of manic or high, when that switches to like a psychosis or fear or terror or depression or something. It's like wanting to not participate in that, and the brain just shuts down. But this feels like, okay, Get me out of this thing that would cause the brain to shut down. So maybe the brain won't shut down. But then I don't even want to think in terms of prevention, because that was dangerous last time. It could end up being just as bad. Part of me feels like it's a sadness for their sake, because they don't understand some of the things that I feel that I've seen. I really don't know if I know anything. I don't know. I'm not sure. And I probably never will be. But at the same time, being sure that I'm not sure is some kind of surety, in that I'm pretty sure I've seen how that conditioning really damages the brain, especially when the brain cells are really trying to grow and anchor in unconditioning, in unconditional love. And one feels like one has seen clearly that the conditioned exposing oneself to that on a daily basis it just damages the brain. And that's part of what I was thinking was possibly happening before when I was on the micronutrients, was that since I wasn't poisoning my brain, I was able to see things more clearly. And I thought I saw things pretty clearly, how they unfolded. But then I still didn't get myself out of there. And so I'm still taking some medication, but I'm taking a lot of vitamins, and I feel like I'm seeing things clearly still. And I'm seeing that by interacting with the conditioning, I'm going to be a puppet of that at this point. And that's how it's going to be. So there's nothing I can do except use the power of human motility and mobility and move myself somewhere else. So that's where the sadness for the condition comes in, because they don't see that I'm a sparkly, shiny human being and I can bring some joy. And with my brain working certain things out, it has seen some of the joy that I've possibly brought. I even saw it today, like looking as unconditional love at a baby. That light coming out of the eyes to the baby changes their brain. Like, it literally changes their brain. So if I had a baby and I was a parent who had like expectations and judgments coming out on the baby or the young child, that's going to warp the child's brain. But the unconditional light, it really does something. And I know it. But others who are conditioned can't say, oh, well, there's this unconditional love coming out of the light of that person's eyes onto this lovely, beautiful being of a baby. And this person, even though they haven't been able to be as functional according to society, sure has an important function in this constellation. So I'm saddened that, I don't know why I should be saddened, because It's something that can't be seen. You know, and I could say, I can't be seen. And it's funny, my nickname is Seen. So I can't be seen. I can't be seen anymore. It's either I can be seen or I can't be seen. And I'm not seen, so it doesn't, like, and I don't feel upset for myself. I feel sad for that, because what I'm saying is I'm gonna take this light somewhere else. Like, this light and keeping the light of the brain cells intact, that is my ultimate responsibility, really. More so than playing a limited role. And that's where, you know, attachments come into play, like being attached to being somewhere for the sake of being a part of something that only leads to more conditioning, because people can't change if they can't see. It's the same as, say, you know, a person going into the freedom state of consciousness temporarily and being approached by a psychiatrist versus a shaman. If that person needing support in that initial vulnerable state is seen by a shaman and listens to what that person's going through, a completely different path or trajectory will take place than being seen by a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist's job is to put that person back into some semblance of who they were, to kind of place them back within old structures, to have that person be recognizable somewhat to people that know that person. Sometimes the people that know that person still abandon them. And the shaman's job is to help that person transform into something completely different. And, you know, depending on what is in the epigenetic matrix, that's going to be, like, that's partly going to be what allows one to flower or not. So, yeah, I've talked for half an hour without even looking at any notes. And I've seen so many things lately. And it doesn't matter. Again, the theme of my life is having to do things on my own. Maybe not receiving compassion in moments when I really felt I needed it. But in that way, realizing that I am all alone and I need to transform not into a victim that needs compassion, but a being which is compassion itself. And I feel it's an act of compassion to not allow, that sounds weird, but to leave and allow people to remain the same. Not allow, that's not the right word. To not be around others who are uncomfortable witnessing a very fluid and dynamic being, changeable. And I feel that when that being goes somewhere else that's more congruent with being changeable, one won't necessarily go from mania to depression. One might go from enlightened to, just kind of in a normal state. Or like if the energy of the environment is really high, then I don't feel that consciousness will fall so much. And the other thing that's interesting about this being a changeable being is that, or really fluid and dynamic, is that at the same time it's very solid and unchangeable. The other day I heard a bunch of people tell their story, supposed mental illness, and man, with what my brain has seen, I just feel like I wish I could help those people, because one woman was talking about how like everything was moving, and like the floor was like moving and warping, and the walls, and they look at a picture and it was like menacing or something, and then look back and it was changed, and saying something like she was trying to look at the picture and the floor at the same time, and she couldn't, and she knew she had to choose from looking at one and the other, and then it would change if she looked. Or I can't remember how she explained it, but I was like, the brain is starting to see that reality isn't solid. It's not material. It's not objective. It's going into a state that is actually more truthful of how things are. But the trouble is when it first goes into that, it's information overload. It's sort of like, and I don't want to repeat things I've said before, but I will probably end up repeating some stuff, because I've talked about how, people who never were able to see, and then somehow through technology their vision was restored. Well, it's just like a confusing, overwhelming mumbo jumbo that doesn't make any sense, because they've never seen before. So it's the same thing when the brain goes into a state of seeing, like the brain is changing the way it operates, and then that changes the way reality looks, and it can't keep up at first, and it's overwhelming. So, and the thing too is that when the brain goes into that state, it's entered into a state where it can never stop learning. It's the state of learning every second, pretty much. And classifying that as a mental illness and medicating it is like going back to the wanting to know how things are as a conclusion or a theory. Like, okay, this is how it is. A, B, C, D, facts, and that's all there is to know. Now go back and watch TV and enjoy yourself. The other state is watching the show of the universe every moment of every day. And if the brain can get with that, it's really fascinating. So much more fascinating than TV. We wouldn't want to watch TV again, very rarely. And, the whole entertainment industry would fall apart. So, and I talked about all that learning stuff and how the brain stopped learning, and labeling stops learning. The brain has to be willing to learn, but the thing is sometimes it doesn't want to know certain things. And I'm sure there's a lot of things that I still don't understand, that I don't want to understand yet. And I don't even know if that's the right languaging in terms of I don't want to understand yet. And I think that's one of the things I didn't want to understand, was that I have to leave, because not leaving was my supposed security. Not being all alone. And, you know, the universe is very intelligent. It's showing me this now that I've gotten to a point where I was planning to go away anyway for a period of time in order to have peace and quiet for the crisis that's upcoming mid-June, in a month. And it likely will still happen, and it'll probably be really awful, but I'm seeing that what I feel is security is not security. Security is in doing what I need to do for myself, being myself, and I think that's a big theme, is being myself. And knowing that I'm perfect in every way to me. Obviously, not to everyone else, but to me. And that's all that matters. And there could be a time in the very near future when I fall out of this state. And it's a movement of the universe. It's not a movement that I control as some kind of one single human separate being consciousness. There's no such thing. And that's the other thing that I've sort of understood lately, is this whole, the brain gets confused about this whole idea of separation or not being separate. It's like one isn't separate, but then as soon as one separates oneself from the conditioning, one is separate, but then one is everything. So it's like very paradoxical. It's like I can be alone and be everything. So I can be separate and everything, which that's a paradox, right? Or I can, be related to the conditioning and be little old me and not be separate. But then I am separate because the conditioning is the perspective of being a separate entity in these conflicted relationships. And then being alone is being separate as the entire universe, meaning related to every single living thing. But that's the thing with the whole conditioning. Conditioning is like a virus. It's not a living thing. It's language structures that have taken over living things and wants to assimilate living things into that. So it's easier to be with life, nature, and listen to the woodpeckers and all the different bird symphonies. Human beings have been listening to bird symphonies for all eternity. So it's an action or an activity of eternity. And that's the thing too, when one realizes that one isn't this separate brain. When one's brain is the human brain. We all have the human brain with different bodies, and then we think we're these separate selves. Separate bodies, separate brains, but it's the same brain. So if it's the same brain, it becomes rather obvious that sitting in eternity listening to the eternal bird symphonies has an effect on all human brains. And one realizes one doesn't have to do anything. But it's not a restless non-doing. One doesn't need anything. And I remember Dr. David Hawkins saying, as consciousness goes up, the need for resources goes down. And that was the thing I saw too, like my very first experience where they took me to the hospital after I handcuffed myself, and then I ran away and I was sitting down in the mud by the river, and then I started getting cold. I'm like, well, what was that about? It's like, oh, in that moment, what I realized is I'm a human being, I have a body, I need food, clothing, and shelter. Meaning I can't be freezing cold, like I'm going to die, like even sitting here in eternity right now, I need food, clothing, and shelter. Everyone does. And then, you know, we have homeless people, and I've talked about that, and I can see that. And then I wonder if they had food, clothing, and shelter, those homeless people that also see there's nothing to do, like they might add a lot of energy to this very active non-doing. Possibly, some at least. Like there's got to be a lot of energy in staying out of it all.